And my first appointment was the ultrasound, which was the confirming you're pregnant, like, look at your new baby. And my husband was sitting in the parking lot in the car with FaceTime. Like the two of us were sitting there, and I'm sitting there holding a camera like this, or I'm holding this camera up on my phone while I'm trying to see what's going on. And I'm in shock, like, wait, that's a baby in there? Like I'm having that baby. So yeah, it's really tough.
Welcome to Social Distances, a podcast where we examine the distances that both separate us and bring us together during the complex and compounded crises of 2020 and beyond. I'm your host, Logan, and for our last episode of this podcast, we end on the topic of birth and new life. We're talking to Barbara Piperata, a professor of anthropology at The Ohio State University, and graduate student Emily Wolfe-Sherrie about what birth and motherhood look like during a pandemic, and the new world these mothers and a brand new generation face during and after these unprecedented times. I can't help but ask if the pandemic and everything going on with our healthcare system and public health, has that changed the way that you view the experience of your pregnancy, or even what your plans are for your birthing experience or anything like that?
Oh, yeah. I started to look up what are the rules for visitations during birth and during your prenatal checkups. I just saw that you are only permitted for during the birth, which is better than nothing. I'm permitted only one support person, so my partner. I'm not going to kick my husband out of the room. So I'm sitting here really, really hoping that my mom can be in that room with us. It's also affected. I got back from the field. I was abroad for a year in Mexico. I came back. I still haven't seen my family because they live in New Mexico. I'm in Ohio. So I'm just and now I'm pregnant. And I can't share this awesome experience with my sister and my mother, which I would love to. My father as well, but let's be real, my sister and mother. And so I take photos every week and send it to my mom and sister, because also this is interesting, but I didn't think I was one who loved attention in terms of physical, look at me. But now that I'm in COVID and I'm kind of hiding in the house, I'm not really thinking about maternity clothes because I can just wear my husband's shirts. And I'm feeling a little sad that people can't see my growing body. There's this, which is weird. I didn't think I would care about that. But I find myself wanting to send photos of my stomach to people. And I think that is so weird. Don't do that, Emily.
Well, you're carrying a human being, so you deserve the attention. And I imagine that's been incredibly difficult to be going through the pandemic, and of course all the anxiety that comes alongside it while pregnant and thinking about bringing new life into the world. But Emily's not the only one balancing pregnancy and a pandemic. Over 3.6 million women in the U.S. gave birth in 2020, not to mention how many were pregnant at some point during the crisis. And women's health and practices surrounding birth were already long talked about topics in the field Emily herself studies with Barbara: anthropology.
What is anthropology? Some people think it's about dinosaurs, and I have to remind them, no, anthropology, if we break down the word, is the study of the human species. It's the study of us. And so it should be inherently interesting for most people.
I guess most people think of anthropology, or maybe the humanities at large, as being somewhat detached from a situation like COVID-19 or any sort of, pandemic or viral infections, et cetera. But actually, of course, there's a lot more factors than just the strictly biological. So as, from an anthropologist's eyes, what are those factors that are also involved with something like COVID-19?
So what attracted me to anthropology was that I was able to see how I can apply my biological knowledge to understanding the human condition. And anthropologists recognize the same things that we see in biomedicine. So biomedicine, that's the US dominant healthcare system, but it's also the dominant system we see globally. It focuses on the individual and the cause of disease as a biological thing. So if we're talking about COVID-19 is caused by the SARS-CoV-2 virus, right? Anthropologists recognize those biological agents. We don't reject that in any way. We are well versed in the biological cause of disease, but we're much more interested, or at least I should say, equally interested in the ways in which the broader context in which people live their lives, where you're born, where you grow, and you live your everyday life, how that context is shaping your exposure to disease, how that context shapes your risk of severity of disease, how that context shapes your access to care, how that context shapes, your entire experience with that illness.
And speaking of some of those sort of holistic perspectives on COVID-19, specifically one thing we've been dealing with a lot as the entire human race, of course, is grief, coping with isolation, a lot of these other things that come along with experiences of death during this time. But of course, there's also the other aspect of life and new life and birth and all of that. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on, everything from grief and death, but also to birth and new life during such a turbulent time, such as COVID-19.
In terms of death, I think, we hear a lot about the hardship that people go through in not being able to be with loved ones when they're sick. Because when we're ill, we're often fearful. And when you're gravely ill with a disease like COVID, of course, you're very fearful of what's going to happen. And there's a desire both from the person who's experiencing the illness perspective to have someone there, but also from those who care about them to want to be there. That's very natural. That's very human. So when we deny people that, we cause a lot of suffering. I think it challenges our biomedical system, which is very good at treating disease, but is not good at dealing with illness and understanding people's experience with it and their needs in order to heal. When we think about coverage of the large funeral gatherings that we saw in New York City in the Jewish population, they were stigmatized for that type of gathering. But an anthropologist would urge us to say, okay, it is true that bringing large groups of people together in the midst of a pandemic that is spread pneumonically, is not a good idea. Anthropologists would urge us to try to balance better that understanding and to appreciate the fact that every culture has rituals around death. How can we balance reducing risk of disease with allowing people to mourn in the way that's culturally appropriate?
Perhaps less talked about during a deadly pandemic, birth presented similar dilemmas for many women considering bringing life into the world.
And as I mentioned with the case of death, we see the same kind of problems coming up when we look at the other side of the life spectrum, when we look at birth. Hospitals are not well set up to deal with the pandemic alongside this extremely social event. Birth for every human society is a celebrated event. In the United States, it is extremely medicalized, which means that we take what is a natural process in life. What's more natural than reproduction? The species depends on it. And we've made it into a medical condition that requires surveillance. And that's meant that we've moved the process of pregnancy and the monitoring of pregnancy and women's health during pregnancy, the birth itself, and that postpartum period from the domain that used to be very much about women and kin to the domain of biomedicine. And so all of these things are heavily surveilled by a biomedical system now. In the United States, almost 100% of women, very close to that, give birth in a hospital setting. We have women who are very fearful of it because we've been told it's dangerous, which is absurd because it is so natural. And because of that fear, women need, I think they feel a need for even more social support, although to think that any woman could do this alone, should do this alone, or is a healthy thing to do alone is a misunderstanding of what it means to be human.
According to the New York Times, communities across America have seen increased interest from mothers-to-be seeking midwives who can aid in home births or other births outside the traditional healthcare system during the pandemic. Whether because they're worried they will test positive for COVID in the hospital and potentially be forced to social distance with their newborn baby, or because they want to make sure they can have their partner or family in the room with them.
Well, women have had to make decisions. My partner can be there with me or my doula, but I can't have both now, okay? So that's a cause of stress. It's made women worry about going into a hospital setting where they know people are being treated for a highly contagious disease. Do I want to give birth in that place? But at the same time, we have a society telling women, at least here in the United States, you can't choose anything else. I mean, the hospital is the place women give birth. You're supposed to give birth there. It's dangerous. You need to do it there. That causes even more fear. It's not giving women options to adapt, to make choices that are best for them. So in that article, I think something really important that the authors bring up is that this is not the first time we've been having this conversation. During Hurricane Katrina, we had this conversation because hospitals at that point were also overloaded dealing with other health issues. And then women had to come in and give birth, and there wasn't space, and there were all kinds of problems. And we started questioning, is it really necessary for every woman to have to give birth in a hospital? If the pregnancy is not complicated, why couldn't she do this in a home setting and not risk having to go to a hospital and expose herself and her newborn to an infectious disease and do it at home? So I think we're revisiting some of those questions, and I think that's a good thing.
For the majority who did give birth in a hospital during the pandemic, the quality of care often suffered. One study published in the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology Maternal Fetal Medicine compared deliveries at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center during January and February and March and April of 2020, before and after COVID-19 protocols were put in place. Out of 1,936 deliveries tracked, length of hospital stay dramatically decreased with COVID protocols in place. Mere one-night postpartum stays after vaginal deliveries jumped from about 25% to 48.5%, and stays of 2 nights or fewer after C-sections jumped from about 12% to over 40%.
I think some other things that have come up in the media that I've seen reported is that times in the hospital have been shortened in order to kind of move women through, as well as concerns over potential increases in C-sections, because you can control those, right? You can time those and you can move people out almost like a conveyor belt, like a machine, you know? And I think that's also, we know that cesarean section is not the ideal way to give birth. I studied the gut microbiome and its formation in babies right now in a project we have in Brazil. We know that being born vaginally has a huge impact on that gut microbiome, which shapes the infant's immediate development as well as their long-term health. So an increase in C-sections in a country that already has a pretty high cesarean section rate is not a good thing. And that is being associated with the COVID pandemic now. So I think there's a lot of things that are, that we should be questioning and thinking about in terms of how can we make birth better for women in this country and in all places better.
But across cultures, birth isn't traditionally a sterile or isolated experience. And while COVID has certainly made us feel that especially painfully, it's also making us reconsider our practices and understanding of bringing new life into the world in general. Before the pandemic hit, Emily was doing fieldwork in Mexico on exactly this topic.
Specifically, my work is in Coatepec, Veracruz, Mexico. And I was looking at La Cuarentena. So I was looking at a postpartum practice there where women have these rules about what they do, what they don't do during this 40 days postpartum.
And is this special time, this 40 days, does that translation, is it quarantine?
Yeah, interesting. La Cuarentena is the quarantine. So right now there's the COVID Cuarentena. And so I was living in the COVID Cuarentena studying La Cuarentena. So yeah, it does translate to the quarantine. And 40 is 40 in Spanish as well. So there's kind of a play on of like the quarantine is 40 days. Let me give you background of what it is. And so basically in Coatepec, in the small town in Veracruz, what we see is this postpartum practice where women are told that they should and should not eat certain foods. So for example, they should drink lots of atoles, which is kind of this grain-based beverage, very sugary. It's delicious because it's going to help breast milk come in for the infant. They should not be eating certain foods like spicy food. They should not be eating pork. That could cause infection. They should not be eating cítricos, which is citruses. So they have kind of these certain foods that they eat and that they don't eat during that time. They also have activities that they do and don't do during that time. So you're not supposed to do a lot of housework. You're not supposed to sweep. You're not supposed to make quick movements. You're not supposed to have sexual relations. cooking the food you don't do when you're in this postpartum period. And so typically, because all of these things really require social support, if you are told you're not supposed to cook food, and that's something that you typically do in the household, who's going to cook the food, right? So what ends up happening is these women either move into a female family member's household for part of this 40-day period, or a mother or a mother-in-law will come in and they will live with the female for that period of time as well. So these practices are in place in order to protect women physically as well as emotionally as well. This is a time where they receive a lot of love.
But while these women often reported sadness that they couldn't celebrate in the same way during the pandemic, most women actually reported that their ability to practice La Cuarentena didn't actually change that much during COVID quarantine, because they still had intimate household members providing support. Currently, of course, our connotations of quarantine are very, very negative, but in this sense, it's sort of a positive time of resting, of social experiences, of care, of love.
Mm-hmm. No, it's beautiful. And it's really seen cross-culturally. There are a lot of practices elsewhere that have similar things, like in Asia and China, specifically Taiwan. They have a practice called doing the month. And so the women for about their time period is about 30 days, but they have similar things where they have foods that they eat, that they don't eat, in part because they're balancing the body from the hot and the cold, so the yin and the yang. So they eat certain foods to warm the body back up. But in this time, they also have family members who are there to help them. And something that's really important to point out here is that these cultural components, we talk about cultural practices as maybe important to maternal mental health in the postpartum, as well as physical health and infant health. But it is important to point out that there is social support behind all of that.
But just as COVID complicated the world for expectant mothers, it also complicated it for the ones they're expecting, babies, born into a world dramatically altered by disease and fear. And we know that the experience of the mother is, of course, directly linked to then the experience of the child, whether that's, of course, the mother dealing with postpartum depression or increased isolation or lack of help from friends and family, but also, of course, a child growing up in isolation as well, both perhaps biologically in terms of exposure, but also socially in terms of exposure.
As I mentioned earlier, we're a social species. Children learn by being around other. They're literally embody that, cognitively, because interacting with lots of different individuals, they pick up different patterns. They learn new things. So those interactions we know are important for their cognitive development. And we also know that, going back to that discussion we were having earlier about the microbiome is shaped by children interacting with their environment. They're born virtually sterile in terms of their gut microbiome. And we know that gut microbiome is related to their growth and development at the time, immediately. So their immediate growth and development, as well as their health in the future. So if they're in an environment where they have limited contact with other people, which is they're literally going to embody that microbiome from being in contact with other people and with the environment, the surfaces and being outside and contact with other children. All of that is kind of reducing that exposure, which could have profound impacts. But, things have been coming up lately. There's an article in the New York Times today looking at a whole other aspect of isolation, which is lead exposure. So when we think about a child in isolation in a wealthy household where there may be a lot of enriching activities that parents can do with them, the impact may not be the same as for a child who's in a household that is, as they discuss in this New York Times article, may have high levels of lead. And so spending more time indoors, more time isolated means greater exposure. And then the other piece of it that they talk about, and I was fascinated by it because these are the kinds of little things that we don't think about that are going to have an impact.
While the pandemic forced us to reconsider our physical distances, in other ways, it also highlights the ways that we're tied to one another.
I have hope that we can maintain this dialogue about disparities and start to actually do something about it. I'm happy to see the media covering those disparities much more than we have with other diseases in the not so recent past. So that gives me hope. that this idea of social determinants of health and understanding this broader context and shaping people's well-being and being sensitive to disparities is something that we're going to be paying more and more attention to because it's really needed.
Because we hope that our world not only survives COVID, but also grows brighter from it for the sake of a whole new generation whose lives have just begun.
No, as an individual, you're not going to go out and change, lead exposure among all children. You're not going to be the one to bring running water to every corner of this country where it's missing, which includes Appalachia. We don't need to go to a Native American reservation in the Dakotas or in Arizona to find that. We find that right here in our backyard, right? You might not feel like you're going to make that kind of change, but you do have enormous power as a voting person, as a citizen of this country with voting rights, to talk to your politicians, to voice these concerns, to keep them on the agenda. And like I said, as a teacher, I will be keeping them in the minds of students so that we don't quickly forget when we close the COVID chapter that it's kind of behind us and we're just moving forward and not thinking about, what did we learn from that? Because like I mentioned earlier with Hurricane Katrina, we learned a lot of these lessons about women's birth choices and options and the stress of birth and the ways in which that exacerbated it and the inequalities that were exacerbated by it. And then we quickly forgot. So let's try not to quickly forget by keeping it in people's mind. And I think the media also plays an important role is to continue to bring these kinds of stories and disparities into the public discourse, even when we're not in the middle of a pandemic. So I think in those ways we can keep this alive and like I said, putting pressure on the system to change is really important. And we all have a role in that.
I'm your host, Logan, and this is Social Distances, where each week we look at a different cross-section of society that has been impacted by the crisis and unpack topics ranging from the environment, earth and death, shelter, media, race relations, and more, through insights from historians, anthropologists, policymakers, and other researchers. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. And check out the video edition on social media under @Midstory or at www.midstory.org. This program is made possible in part by Ohio Humanities, a state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Social Distances is produced by Midstory, edited by Samuel Chang, written by Ruth Chang and Logan Sander, with original music by Dream Louder and graphics by Jesse Walton.